On November 20th, I again tortured myself on your behalf by watching one of the Democrat debates. It began like you might expect, with talks of impeachment. I know, you're not surprised. It also got off to something of a shaky start with Amy Klobuchar, who was literally vibrating.
Vladimir Putin every minute of the day. That is what this guy does. And I think it is very, very important that we have a president that when I was at the Carter Presidential Museum, and on the wall are etched the words of Walter Mondale when he looked back at their 4 years, not perfect. And he said this: "We told the truth, we obeyed the law, we kept the peace." We told the truth, we obeyed the law, we kept the peace. That is the minimum that we should expect in a president of the United States.
Was she that nervous, or does she have a seizure disorder? That was something else. And then Joe Biden starts stumbling over himself like he's become, frankly, known for.
And number two, he's going to have to be able to go into states like Georgia and North Carolina and other places. He held up aid to make sure that, while at the same time innocent people in the Donbass are getting killed by Russian soldiers.
Then we got into the meat of the debate, which was obviously about how rich people are bad. I know, it's ironic because how much money these people make is what determines their eligibility for even getting on the stage. They're required to have enough donors, enough money, just to even appear, and yet they talk about how bad the rich are. Anyway, they were talking about the wealth tax once again, which is a tax on money that you have saved, money that has already been taxed numerous times already. And they talked with this stereotypical mantra at this point they've been using for at least like 50 years about the rich people not paying their fair share. I know you've heard it before, you must have. And the truth is, the rich people do pay their fair share. They pay more than it. The bottom 44% by income of Americans doesn't pay any federal income tax whatsoever. And the top 1% pays more taxes than the bottom 95%. And since I'm telling the truth and actually using facts, I'll display my sources for you. Unlike these other people who'll just throw out numbers that when you look aren't even true. There's no fact checker there to call people when they lie. If there was a fact checker, I think these debates would have been a lot longer. Spartacus, otherwise known as Cory Booker, he has plans for raising revenue, in other words, taxing you even more.
But I agree that we need to raise the estate tax. We need to tax capital gains as ordinary income, real strategies will increase revenue.
There's no such thing as too many taxes. I mean, it's your money and there's so much that they can do with it. They have plans. They always like to talk about their plans. Yes, their plans for what they're going to do with your money, which is give you free stuff, and you're supposed to appreciate the fact that they're taking your money to give it back to you in these schemes. But what they're really doing is embracing the politics of covetousness or of envy. This other person has more than you, so you should embrace your jealousy and take what he has for yourself by voting for this candidate. That is, I guess, the Democrat morality at this point. Steyer was actually berated by a moderator over the fact that he basically bought his way onto the stage.
Mr. Steyer, you have denounced the special interests that pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the political process to influence it. But in fact, you have spent over $300 million of your own money in support of your political goals. How do you respond to critics who see you as the embodiment of a special interest?
But remember, you know, it's not just Steyer. All of the people on stage are actually pretty wealthy, even when they act like the rich are boogeymen of sorts. And then Steyer mentioned term limits, and as you watch this next clip, just watch how the rest of them react.
And I'm talking now about structural reform in Washington, D.C. Term limits. If you want bold change in the United States, you're going to have new and different people in charge. I'm the only person on this stage who will talk about term limits. Vice President Biden won't, Senator Sanders won't, even Mayor Pete Buttigieg will not talk about term limits and structural change.
Yeah, they all look pretty uncomfortable because they're all career politicians. They'll all be out of their jobs if we were to implement term limits. And make no mistake, Congress is not going to enact term limits and vote themselves out of jobs. It's just not going to happen. But Andrew Yang, he was fascinating, I'll say. He seemed to be more worried about the threats of tomorrow than those of today.
The next commander-in-chief has to be focused on the true threats of tomorrow: climate change, artificial intelligence, loose nuclear material, military drones, and non-state actors. And if you look up, we're in the process of potentially losing the AI arms race to China right now, because they have more access to more data than we do, and their government is putting billions of dollars to work subsidizing the development of AI in a way that we are not.
His game plan is actually funneling more money into Silicon Valley. It's not obvious unless you really pay attention and you think about it. If your business is online, you probably already know it is obvious to you. But he's worried about big tech, right? But the only proposed solution is always funneling more money into big tech, into our American companies. But really, just how American are our American companies in the area of big tech? They're really not. In fact, they're companies that largely seem to hate America, seem to hate American ideals at least. And these big tech companies that are proposed as American big tech companies are helping China to build their so-called AI system. And when the American military and American government tried to get Google's help in building something of our own, the Google employees walked out because they don't really like American values or want to help the American military. I mean, what does that really say? You tell me. But this party is so obsessed with lambasting the rich that they've begun to applaud themselves for being the poorest. And this is something that's kind of fascinating because traditionally, if you're poorer, it means that you haven't accomplished as much. You're less successful in a measurable way. I mean, of course, only Steyer is the only one on the stage who's actually accomplished something, actually run a business successfully, right? But now they're congratulating themselves for their failures.
I never thought I'd be on a Forbes magazine list, but they did one of all the candidates by wealth, and I am literally the least wealthy person on this stage.
Being in last place isn't something that you would normally brag about, but what he's trying to do is take the Democrat Party's mantra of the rich are bad and turn that into, well, I'm not rich and therefore I'm good. But really, the Democrat Party has for a long time been trying to redefine morality. And, they're trying to manipulate what is a largely Christian culture to this day, fortunately. And they're trying to redefine our morality to say that money is the root of evil, whereas biblically it's said that the love of money is the root of all evil. You might say, for the love of money, that it's kind of like the lust for money that is the root of all evil, which is what these people do. When they engage in the politics of envy and jealousy, they're trying to encourage you to want somebody else's wealth and to take that wealth for yourself. They're engaging in that very thing. It's also something that's right out of the communist playbook, where you turn everyone against the business owners. The goal, ultimately, is the destruction of society itself. Anyway, moving on, Amy Klobuchar actually tried to proclaim this.
What I said was true. Women are held to a higher standard.
Where exactly are women held to this higher standard? Because in the workplace, employers are clamoring for female employees and trying to put them in positions of power in their companies, even to the company's detriment. California is trying to require that women are on the boards of all the different companies there. There are benefits for having a female-owned business throughout the country, no matter where you are. You can get loan opportunities and tax breaks for having a female-owned business. Hillary ran an entire political campaign on the basis that I'm a woman, therefore vote for me. Imagine now for a second if one of these candidates was to run a campaign and say, hey, I'm a guy, not a woman, vote for me. Can you imagine the outrage? Not to mention, there's no expectation for women to go to war in our society. That's why women don't sign up for the draft. And there's female preference in divorce courts, family courts. There's actually a lot of privileges available for women over men in our society. In fact, if a woman physically assaults a guy and he defends himself against her, attacks her back, fights her back, he's most likely going to be the one in trouble legally. Women in the West, we have more privilege than we've had at any point in history. Privilege over men, in fact. And yet she claims that women are held to a higher standard. It's just an excuse for the fact that she doesn't have any policies that people like. And Anyway, let's just move forward. Take a look at Democrats on housing. And remember, it's Democrat areas where tent cities tend to pop up, like San Francisco.
And we need to apply resources here to make sure that we build literally millions of new units. But the other thing that's going to be true about building these units is we're going to have to build them in a way that's sustainable. That in fact, how we build units, where people live, has a dramatic impact on climate and on sustainability.
Units, he said. I am not living in a pod. Ever. But what he's really saying is, expect a lower standard of living while we become an immigrant welfare state and fund everybody else's military. That's what he's really saying. To lift them up, we have to sacrifice ourselves. We must go down. It's the policy of America last, you might say. And one of those sustainable materials he was talking about. Sustainable like in India, where they make the houses out of dung? Is that what he means? Because we tend to make our houses out of things like, tar and paints and concrete and metal and plastics and latex. And I don't think that he's going to be very comfortable with those things. They don't seem very earth-friendly from his perspective. So what will those pods be like? Will it be like Little House on the Prairie? I asked legitimately because it seems like what he's talking about is building houses that sacrifice safety and comfort and even longevity for the earth or for nature. And then Elizabeth Warren, otherwise known as Pocahontas, actually tried to claim this, which isn't even true.
Think of it this way. Our housing problem in America is a problem on the supply side, and that means that the federal government stopped building new housing a long time ago, affordable housing.
Again, there weren't any fact checkers on stage because how could there have been with so many lies? But this was just a very obvious, in-your-face lie. There is still government-subsidized housing. Houses are erected that are taxpayer-funded all of the time. It's just completely false. And despite all this talk about a housing crisis and how we need more houses, they then actually talked about how they're going to make life harder for landlords, for landowners. Really.
My plan is very simple. If you're a renter who pays more than a third of your income in rent, then you will get a refundable tax credit between the amount you're paying and the area median rent. And by the way, for those people who are facing eviction, it is about time that the only people when they show up in rentals court that have a lawyer is not the landlord, it is also low-income families struggling to stay in their homes.
Thank you, Senator.
To recap, he just said that you wouldn't have to pay a tax if your rent exceeds more than a third of your income. Then you don't have to pay tax. So what's it really doing? It's encouraging people to make bad financial decisions and also to steal from the system. So you buy or rent a big, expensive, ritzy place and you just don't pay tax after that. You know, everybody else does. The people who are making good decisions, they pay tax, but you don't pay tax. The government is promoting you overextending yourself. And then, top of that, if there's a problem with you, if you're a bad tenant, for example, the government is going to pay for your lawyer, not for the lawyer of the landlord, but for the tenant who can't afford because he purchased something that he can't afford, or is just a bad tenant, is being kicked out for some bad behavior. The government's going to be there to pay for that lawyer, and they wonder why there's a housing shortage in Democrat areas. Why there are tent cities popping up, why people won't build in those areas, why people don't want to be property owners in those areas. It's not really much of an enigma when you think about it. And then, moving on, Steyer decided to use climate alarmism to embrace and promote tyranny. Does this remind you of anyone?
I'm the only person on this stage who will say that climate is the #1 priority for me. It's a state of emergency, and I would declare a state of emergency on day one. I would use the emergency powers of the presidency. Stopping pipelines, stopping fossil fuel plants, ensuring clean energy across the country. My climate policy was led by environmental justice and members of the communities where this society has chosen to put our air and water pollution.
My resolve has never been stronger.
So this is how liberty dies.
with thunderous applause.
So, he would use the emergency powers of the presidency. I don't know what that means exactly, but worst case, it means martial law. So, what, are we going to have tanks rolling down the streets, preventing people from using their cars? Or are we going to have the military shutting down gas stations? It's a legitimate question because he didn't elaborate on what exactly he meant. But then he went on to say that this would be the main issue of foreign policy as well. How? What does that mean? Does that mean that we're going to start bombing the countries with the highest emissions? Or we're going to invade India and China? I doubt it, but he didn't say, and he seems so crazy on this issue that, frankly, who knows? Biden would later agree that yes, of course climate change is the top issue, how dare he have said anything else? And then Bernie Sanders would jump in and say, we don't have decades to do something, we're running out of time now. And then he'd go on about climate refugees, which is just some other excuse for bringing immigrants here who will most likely vote for Democrats. Then they moved on to the most nauseating area, I think, of the whole debate, which was their topic about race. And in this area, Tulsi Gabbard talked about institutional racism and repeated the rather tired mantra that black people are incarcerated higher than any other group because of proof of racism, that proves racism. Never mind the fact that statistically speaking, these people just commit more crimes. And that's why they're locked up in higher numbers than others. Nothing else. But anyway, as I mentioned earlier, Yang threw his support behind Silicon Valley, and he did that again in this section. I think that Andrew Yang recognizes the power of big tech in propagandizing and stifling dissent of Democrats. In other words, he recognizes the power of big tech to manipulate elections, and I think he's embracing it. He talked about people being radicalized by hate groups. That may be a term that you've heard recently, if you've been paying attention. It was pretty familiar language. It was basically a wink and a nod to YouTube. Like, keep up the good work, silencing those conservatives.
I talked to an anti-hate activist named Christian Picciolini, who told me about how he was radicalized over a 10-year period. He said he was a lonely 14-year-old and that he was reached out to by a hate group.
Even though the segment was about race, and gun violence was specifically mentioned, the statistics about how most gun violence occurs in black communities or the inner city wasn't specifically mentioned at any point. To his credit though, Yang did mention fatherlessness. He didn't mention, of course, that fatherlessness is largely caused by Democrat policies, but, I'll take what I can get. When these people use terms like hate group, you know what they mean. They mean people like me, the Salvation Army. Hate groups. Yeah, Kamala Harris tried to maximally divide people into groups of victimhood so that then she could identify with these various groups and claim them as her own. Yeah, her pandering to identity politics was really transparent.
And we've got to recreate the Obama coalition to win. And that means about women, that's people of color, that's our LGBTQ community, that's working people, that's our labor unions. But that is how we are going to win this election.
Pete then decided that he could do that too. And he decided to essentially say, vote for me because I'm gay. Like, my gayness trumps all of your minorities.
My rights expanded by a coalition of people like me and people not at all like me, working side by side, shoulder to shoulder, making it possible for me to be standing here wearing this wedding ring.
He's proud of what militants like him have done to our society, and he dubs himself the Christian candidate. Really, I can't even give my full opinion on this matter, because I'll get banned for sure, maybe some other time on some other platform. Probably. But then, in a moment of just complete lack of self-reflection, Bernie Sanders, the socialist who constantly complains about other people's wealth, then took to the end of the debate to brag about how many donations he had received for his political campaign. This is somebody who has talked not only about wealth and richness and etc., but also about how money in politics is a bad thing. And then he's like, but look how much money I've gotten.
During this campaign, I am proud to say that I have received more campaign contributions than any candidate at this point in an election in American history. Over 4 million contributions, averaging $18 apiece.
Isn't money a sign of the problem? A sign of corruption? A sign of oppression, even? Apparently not when it's his money or his houses. Kamala Harris took to the end of the debate to smear Tulsi Gabbard for going on conservative shows like Fox News. And then, in almost the same breath, she said that she was the uniter, able to connect with all Americans, all people. Conservatives, apparently, aren't people. They're just, I don't know, deplorables, I guess. There is no way that these people can believe what they're saying. Any of them. After you watch these debates, you're like, they can't live according to these philosophies. They can't really believe what they're saying. But the biggest differences between these people, these Democrats, and conservatives is when you watch a Republican debate, you'll see that they debate real issues using actual numbers and facts. And when you watch one of these debates, it's more like the Democrats are art school students who appeal to emotion, who try and appeal to people who don't understand the core issues at all and can thus be maximally manipulated by emotional arguments. And I think that pretty much sums up the real differences between this crazy bunch and conservatives. It's really telling, actually, because the facts are on one side and the emotions are on the other. Like, you can be rational and reasonable, or you can be a crazy nut who's screaming about climate change and the world going underwater. Stop! Don't leave yet. Since you made it to the end, you probably enjoyed that video. In that case, here are some other videos that you might enjoy. The updates link at the top will provide you with better ways to be more reliably notified of new videos, and it also has social media information, that kind of thing. That's because you know how this site is. Well, the link at the bottom, the store link, that's in case you're looking for merchandise or our healthier products. Thanks.